I got chastised.
So we're ready to go? Hello everybody! Welcome to my third class on esoteric psychology. We're on the third chapter. I just want a couple announcements. My next class will be next Sunday, July 11th. So not the 4th of July, I'm sorry, not next Sunday. That's the 4th of July, we're not having a class. It'll be the Sunday after that, it's July 11th, 3 to 5 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. And also, I checked out the new website, light.org, and I think it's a great, new, wonderful website that Paul created. So, guys, check that out. So, check out the new website. So, alrighty. So, with that, I have a quote from Albert Einstein. I didn't put it in my slides, but quote of the day: "Perfection of means and confusion of goals seem, in my opinion, to characterize our age." Albert Einstein. Perfection of means and confusion of goals. Like we perfected our means, but we don't have the right goals.
We don't have clear goals. Boy.
In his opinion, characterize his
Another
age.
way of saying that we're not mature enough to handle the technology we've created.
Maybe that's another way to say it.
We don't know where we're going, but we have a direct route.
Right. We can get there. Exactly. And I don't mind questions. I don't mind discussion in the class. I really, I wanted to have this as a discussion class, but there's a lot of material, so I have to get through that. But if you have a question that pertains to something, go ahead and ask, and we can discuss it. So no problems there. All right, and with that, let's start our class.
So my first question, Yvette, is the last phrase of that wonderful quote, "After confusion of goals," is what?
In my opinion, which was Einstein's opinion, characterizes our age.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So what is a symbol? I love this part. Of course, we probably recognize most of these things. Without words, we could probably recognize a symbol, right? However, I was going to bring in something. There was a symbol that I got from my matrix energetics. And that symbol wouldn't mean anything to anybody if you didn't know what was behind it, right? But we know these symbols because we see them all the time. And we don't even have to know, we don't even have to say the word in our head. We just know what that is, right?
Are they in the collective unconscious?
Probably. Some of us.
Sorry, I don't know what that black and green one.
I don't
the
either.
black and green one is.
Batman.
Oh,
That
Batman?
is?
That's a Batman symbol. That's a symbol of our culture, though, right?
Yeah.
Because if you don't know Batman, then you
No,
wouldn't know.
Batman is a bat wing.
You're
Yeah.
reading the positive instead of the
Right.
negative.
I did that the first time I
Leave the
saw it.
black image as the bat.
Oh,
I see it as a open mouth with two tonsils.
That's all.
But you know what?
Just
The
saying.
green is off. It's
It's
kind
somebody's
of a
tonsils.
yellow.
Yeah, that's
Right.
right.
See, it's yellow.
Right.
Rather than green.
when I first saw that in the movie theater, I looked at that thing and looked at that thing and could not figure out what is that.
Yeah. You expect two face-to-faces,
Yeah.
to kiss.
All right, so let's have some definitions, and that's what your handouts are. To take notes if you want to, it kind of gives the outline of what's here, but it's all up to you, it's your notes. Anyway, so Zane's definition of a symbol is that which stands for something. And then the dictionary definition is something that stands for or suggests something else by reason of relationship or association. I like that part, the visible sign of something invisible. I kind of like that one, it was interesting. And then, of course, in the dictionary, you got various definitions. So, we all know what a symbol is, right? I don't have to read them all.
That second one has that which has been repressed in it.
An object or act representing something in the unconscious mind that has been repressed. Okay, that's from a psychology standpoint. Because in the dictionary, they'll say where it comes from. Because we might have different definitions depending on what area we're studying, right? So that's in a psychology sense.
And that can show up a lot in dreams.
Right, and that's what this whole class is going to be about dream symbols, about language and dreams. That's the title. Hello. Okay. I love this from the book. The mental images that the mind holds are the symbols of its physical and mental experiences. So these are, I don't even know what this is from, so.
It's a happy face, smile face.
But it has a
It's
gunshot.
not a head, it has a gunshot.
It's the
distorted
down,
version
it's the
of it.
down with Walmart movement.
Maybe that's what it is. But this is what, the BMW or the
Mercedes.
Okay. And these are religious symbols, the Jewish symbol, Christianity, you know. All these symbols are from our mental and physical experiences. Like this,
Right.
we know what that is, right? The apple.
Yeah.
This is for Windows. If you've never seen a computer, you might not know what this symbol is.
I didn't know what that one was.
Right. And so, so remember that a symbol is tied in with your own experiences. And just because you might know that this swoosh symbol means Nike, a brand name, a consumer product in our world, in the past that might have not been the symbol. So remember that too. Our connotations of symbols change throughout time. They can. Luckily, our astrology doesn't. Our symbols, we kept those. So.
Some are good to keep.
Right. So whenever there's a picture like this, it means there's a subheading in the chapter, and then this is the subheading in the chapter, and I have the chapter page. Okay, so that's just what these are. Okay, so this is the next subheading. Symbols are habitually used by the unconscious mind to communicate with bodily organs. The 5 physical senses give us visual images, auditory impressions, odors, perceptions of taste, and sensations of touch. A certain sense impression has come to the unconscious mind through repeated association of experiences to have a definite meaning to the unconscious mind. So even a child that sees this after a while, they know, they don't even have to read, and they know what that means, right? After repeated, they know to stop. And because the experiences in the past have called for some special activity, this activity is also associated with the same thought cells in the astral plane. The sense impression, whatever it may be, thus adds energy to the thought cells, which in turn stimulate physical change. We're going to kind of explain this too. These sentences get more and more explained as we go. So, the visual images, the senses, are the habitual symbols used by the unconscious mind to communicate information to and to command action in the physical body. It becomes a symbol of a condition, and acting upon that condition, the unconscious mind has come to use that symbol in issuing commands to the physical organs. Thus, the unconscious mind communicates information to the physical cells of the body by using the 5 senses. And then these are just, this was in the book about the sight, the ability to feel the etheric vibrations reflected from objects in such a manner as to distinguish and define those objects. And the etheric vibrations is our connection to the astral. It's our energy transfer body that we went over in the past classes. Yeah, and Wellington talked a little bit about going over our nerves, and that etheric, that's the exchange. So, hearing, the ability to feel molecular vibrations that have been set in motion with the range called sound. Some people have a nervous system that is very sensitive, that they can feel the thoughts of others at a distance in such a manner as to recognize their significance. And some people can perceive things that come from the astral body. So those are just the physical senses. And whether through dreams, visions, or divinatory instruments, the unconscious mind finds it easier to communicate whatever it perceives to the objective mind by means of symbols rather than means of arbitrary words. And we often come across, like when I showed you the symbols in the beginning, like the Mickey Mouse ears. Did you say in your mind, oh, Disney? Or did you just go, oh, I know what that means? Did you say
I thought Mickey Mouse.
Okay, you thought
And
Mickey
Mickey
Mouse.
Mouse is Disney.
Right, but all those connotations.
I had gone through 3 or 4 other processes to get to Disney.
All
that
that, right. All those connotations, though, related to something that made sense, but you didn't have to use your words to say it in your mind. You said Mickey Mouse, but you knew what it meant behind that symbol, right? And you didn't have to use the words. That's what our unconscious mind does, to
Right.
communicate to objective mind. We don't use words all the time,
Right.
connecting up. It's just, we have that knowledge, that knowing, oh, I know what that is, oh, I know what that is.
And that habitual, going back to the
Habitual use.
habitual use, like when we were kids growing up, they had this thing on TV called the Mickey Mouse Club.
Right.
And it projected that image on the screen, and it said MICKEY.
Right.
And so that was just, it's hard to get away from thinking Mickey Mouse.
Right, exactly. And all those connotations that went with
Right,
it.
exactly.
So, okay. So another subheading, every thought brings a change in the physical body. Okay, and then this is where I got this information here. I'll put, like, if it's from Zane, it's mostly all from Zane, but every once in a while I get other stuff to just enlighten us a little more. Most experts in the field of psychology and biology agree that the mind and the body are connected in more complex ways than we can even comprehend. Research constantly shows us that the way we think affects the way we behave, feel, and the way our bodies respond. But the opposite is also true. Physical illness, physical exhilaration, exercising, insomnia all affect the way we feel and behave, but also the way we think about ourselves and the world. So it goes both ways. It's not just what you think creates it, but it's also the way you feel creates the way you think, right?
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. Laboratory, and this is from the Zane book he wrote. Laboratory psychologists say no mental modification ever occurs which is not followed by bodily change. This means that every perception, sensation, and conception that creates a change in the astral body also creates a corresponding change in the physical body. Zane gives a couple examples of these. A visual image, like the sight of food, can be used by the unconscious mind as a means of commanding the flow of saliva and the gastric juices as a change in the physical body. Did your body physically change when you saw that? If you were hungry, maybe.
Doesn't look much like a pizza to me.
It took me a while to figure it out. I thought it was celery.
Mine too. Salivate.
I guess sometimes things look better when you're doing the PowerPoint presentation, but when it's actually projected up here, like the colors are different and everything's
Right,
a little
but
different.
now I see the pizza.
Can you see that?
Yeah.
Something flying at your head sets you in motion to move out of the way of the object. And most often you will not pause for visual verification of the object. This physical change is bodily movement, which we can relate to that. We don't stop and pause and think, what is that flying at my head? Maybe you just move. Okay, association, like something flying at your head, has related an image with danger, but also with a special kind of movement to avoid the danger. The visual image itself is used by the unconscious mind as a means of commanding specific action. So these were some symbols of danger. I was hoping people could come up with maybe their own examples of how the physical body changes by your thoughts. You can do that on your own because, these examples were interesting, but I wanted to think about more. So I don't know if you guys can think of those things.
Yeah.
What's letting me on? Yes, I have something here. Okay. Anyone ever see someone's face change when they're drinking alcohol?
Yeah.
Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
And that is a physical change because you look at somebody and you recognize a physical change, even though their face hasn't. It's like whatever's in their inner thoughts can change your physical.
Actors do that beautifully.
Actors
You can
do
watch
that.
an actor, a really skilled actor, not say a word and move, and you are aware of the thought and the emotion relative to what the actor is communicating. And
Exactly.
they're skilled at that, and they call
That's right.
upon a feeling,
Right.
and they transmit with thought that feeling.
And they
And
have
communicate.
that ability because not everybody can do that. But that is a great ability. Yes, exactly. It's a great example. Okay. Universal emotional symbols used by animals and man. This is actually one of the examples. Our sound.
Jane Goodall is a great imitator of the chimp's sounds.
Is she?
as well. Oh, yeah.
All right, so here's another definition, language. Zane's definition, the means by which one individual communicates with another. And then the definitions of language nowadays has come to mean a lot more things. The words, the pronunciation, the methods of combining them, used and understood by the community. I like this one, the means by which animals communicate. These are all in the dictionary, plus a couple more. So this is considered a language because it has definite rules and it has definite meaning to the animals. And we're actually learning that, right? We're learning how animals are communicating. So we call it a language now. I think in Zane's time they didn't actually call it language. They had other rules because Zane was in the book. He was kind of explaining what language was, and he thought this, but I don't think it was in the definition at that time that he was in. Okay, in nesting, and this is Zane's example. In nesting time, if you imitate the distress call of a fledgling bird, every bird in the vicinity, no matter what species, will come close and exhibit signs of anxiety and excitement. All birds recognize the sound as conveying the information that some young bird, perhaps their own, is in trouble. This particular sound then becomes a universal symbol recognized by much of the bird world. And whenever that sound is heard, it becomes a symbol by which the whole flock is made aware of the presence of danger. Thus also a frown, a smile, laughter, tears, etc. are universal symbols recognized in the human world. Laughter the world over is recognized as a symbol of mirth. A smile is recognized denoting pleasure. A frown indicates displeasure, as does the growl of a dog. So he was kind of tying in that we both have universal symbols. Animals and man. Sounds which arise involuntarily from an emotional stress become the auditory symbol associated with that emotion. Weeping is a symbol of grief among men, etc., etc. Thus, the rudiments of language and universal emotional symbols are seen in animals as well as humans. This is another sentence I like. Repeated experience has associated certain images with definite feelings. And whether you like Christmas or not, you have definite feelings associated with those symbols. And then, of course, these bring up a lot of emotions, don't they? Mm-hmm. Symbols of feelings, a lot of emotions. And, 22. Yeah. Okay, symbols are used as the words of our language, and the oldest language is the language of feeling. Definition of feeling: the unconscious mind uses feeling to receive information from the sense organs of the body and to communicate orders back to the body. That which is felt is stored as thought elements in the thought cells of the unconscious mind. So it's not just thoughts that are in the thought cells, it's also feeling is stored in there as thought elements. Feelings impart information to the unconscious mind, information which conditions the future conduct. People can blush, grow pale, exhibit signs of nervousness, and blunder trivial tasks, all based on feelings. The general language of feeling is the oldest language and is the means by which the unconscious mind communicates its desires to the physical organism. So it communicates symbolically in thought, but it communicates desires in feelings. The old language of feeling harks back to the primitive occasions of attack. Feelings command that adrenaline should be secreted, stimulating heart action to move quickly when danger is near. The cells, glands, and organs of the physical body understand the language of feeling better than they understand the words used by the objective mind. The cells and organs of our physical bodies take their orders from feelings, but also from the reasoned commands of objective consciousness. An example: when you get a sliver in your hand and you dig it out, your feelings tell you to move away, right? You don't want a sharp object in your hand. But your objective consciousness tells you to hold still and dig that sliver out so you don't get an infection later on. So both of these things are working. Feelings and your objective consciousness are working for your physical body, right? Yeah. Not just your feelings. Otherwise, get an
You would
infection
never
from
go
a
to the
sliver.
dentist. Or you would never go to the dentist.
You'd never go to the
doctor.
dentist, right? Some things are painful and they have to be painful, and you still know that you have to do them anyway, right? So, and then this is from, I got another sources of the definition of feeling. The perception of events within the body closely related to emotion. It means to perceive through those senses that are not referred to by any special organ. As the known special organs of the senses are the ones mediating the perception of the physical world. The verb to feel came also to mean the perception of events within the body. So it's kind of the undefinition of where those feelings are coming from, because they're not coming necessarily from the eyes or the ears or the nose. It's just that you get that feeling within your body, right?
Do you know what year this definition
Right
came
here?
into being?
I just got it from the internet the other day, so I don't know.
It's a very physical definition.
But see,
of feeling.
but don't get caught up, because the next sentence that I cut out here was that psychologists differ on the definition of feeling.
Of what that is.
Yes, and this is another, I looked up in the dictionary,
Yeah.
a physical dictionary, not the internet one.
Yeah.
A general state of consciousness independent of particular sensations or thoughts. Vague awareness. And there was more definitions that went along, I just cut it down.
Yeah.
But so there's many definitions of it. And actually, it's in my presentation, the difference between these two. And when I first wrote this down, it made sense to me, and then all of a sudden, I started thinking of things, and then I thought, no, I think it's emotion is the opposite, the way they're defining it. And I'm like, well, I don't know. Maybe we'll have a discussion on it. And we were talking about that today, right? So one area of confusion is that feelings are awfully loosely equated with emotions. One can ask a friend how he's feeling today, but it would be awkward to ask him how emotional he is being. Some people might take offense if they were thought to be emotional, whereas it is acceptable for them to show feelings. However, there are fundamental differences between feelings and emotions. Of course, this is one person writing on this website right here. That's where I got this from. So take that to heart.
One of the definitions that I've learned to really love is one that Shirley, I first heard Shirley using it, and she used the concept of movement. When you feel some sort of an inner movement.
Emotion.
Right here.
Yeah.
Well, we characterize it, the manifestation is emotion. It's an actual energy stream of movement that works for me.
Right here.
You can go in
The
different
feeling
directions.
energizes the conceptual. That's your
Response to a stimulus, that
Right.
makes it neutral. It is a neutral definition of feeling, and it can then go and be read as to positive or negative.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
that's yet to be defined.
Right
but
here.
You are
This guy right here wrote there are three feelings: the pleasant one, the unpleasant one, and the neutral one. And then he says the feeling energizes a conceptual response to a stimulus. And I think that's just exactly what you were saying.
Because if it is a stimulus of which you have recorded pain, the
Right.
movement will be towards pain.
Right. But it also energizes a thought, right?
Exactly.
The feeling
Because you
energizes.
have to define what the feeling is with thought.
Right. Right. But if you come to a thought, you can have all the thoughts in the world that you want to do something, but until you get that feeling, the movement to go forward, then you're going to do it. But with just thoughts are great, but the feeling energizes it, gives it momentum behind it. And I love this picture, how these two are connected, the emotions and feelings. They're all connected, but these are kind of closer together, obviously. Again, still from psychologistworld.com. Now we're talking about emotion. Emotion is generated when feeling is united with mind. Emotion is the activity of feeling directed into a mental concept. The peculiarity of any particular emotion is that whilst it is just an emotion, it is nevertheless intimately associated with specific mental attitudes and ideas that have become characteristic of that emotion. Each emotion acts as a nucleus for preset ideas about the world. I want to kind of talk about that. People everywhere can get emotional about religion based on their preset ideas about it. once we kind of get in an emotion with a preset set, it's sometimes we forget about it and we're going along and somebody will mention that word, like Christianity. That emotion will come right back up, right? Even though you could have changed your mind along the way about that, all of a sudden that emotion will appear again, but then you can go, wait a minute, I don't have to feel this way anymore, I've changed it. But the emotion is habitual as well, right?
Right.
I think.
No, it is.
And I like the way this guy wrote that, it's a nucleus for
Yeah.
preset. Like my friend and me went to the movies yesterday, he's taking medication for depression. So overall his emotional state is in a depressed mode. We went and saw the movie Date Night. And it was funny, and he was laughing the whole movie. So even though his general emotional state was because of his thoughts that, you know, he was having very depressed thoughts, he can go and set that aside for a while and watch a movie and laugh through the whole movie. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So to me, emotion is like a state that you can kind of get yourself in because of what you're thinking, because of what your mind is. But your feelings can change and come and go. You know, you can feel good for a few minutes or a while. Anyway, that's how I thought of the emotion and the feeling kind of being different. But I really like what the guy said about being connected to your thoughts. A person is always experiencing some emotion at any one time, and when the present emotion fades away, another emotion will take its place and be felt. When emotions become intense, they neutralize intellectual concerns. In fact, common negatively valued emotions such as self-pity, fear, anxiety, as well as moods like depression, actually tend to inhibit rationality. In particular, intense anxiety seems to produce a mental fog in one's mind, making it impossible to study.
Isn't that what you were talking about this morning? You were talking about trying to find the balance. Where's the balance?
Right. Well, now, you know, these things can affect each other. So even though you think you're being rational, if you have a lot of fear and anxiety, that can taint the way you believe is rational. We've seen that so many times in people.
Oh, wow.
People can rationalize so many things, you know, and it can be based on their negatively valued emotions, right? Okay, so now we're back to Zane. Zane's definition of emotions is emotions arose in the unconscious mind of every form the soul took on in reaction to the conditions of the environment. So Zane's definition is more about it developed through time. He's talking about evolution based on conditions of the environment. You had to change your emotion to suit your environment, I guess.
Well, that seems an acknowledgement that all animal life and other forms of life would have emotion.
Exactly.
Right, it would, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Could you possibly put it in the pleasure-pain category? Which
Yeah.
some psychologists. Animals don't necessarily have emotion, they have instincts relative to, like the splinter in your finger, instinct
Right.
to move from pain or to move into pleasure.
Right.
That's
I think they
another.
exhibit very sublimely complex emotions all the time.
Right.
And to simplify it from our point of view, saying, oh, they're just instinctual movements toward pleasure or away from pain, is trying to create a
Yeah.
false distinction
Right.
between
Well, could
all
it
these soul
be
expressions.
I think they
that
probably
we
need more-
have evolved
Yes.
animals?
Yes, there you go. We are evolved.
Well, I don't know. We had a little last year. We have roadrunners in our yard, and we had a robin's nest up in one of the trees, and Paul and I came home one evening, and the adult robins were so distressed. I mean, I recognized those sounds that they were making and those movements that they were making. And even though they didn't have a mouth that would form, or but they, in their movements, they were clearly distressed because their baby that nest had been robbed, and that baby was injured and down on the ground. And they were following that little baby bird hopping all over the yard. And I recognize that. Now maybe you could say that, my psychology professor used to say anthropomorphizing. I could have been projecting my own feelings, but by God, those birds were certainly responding to something, and it was a lot of anxiety.
Right.
Well, motherhood would be one of those number one instincts that would be, ascribed to account for it. But we can see emotions exhibited from animals when it makes no difference to their, the survival of their offspring or, these major life questions. We can see them communicating different emotions, shame or embarrassment or, it's just not hard to read.
Ducking your tail.
Yeah.
Right? Bad.
Okay, this is another subtitle. Man then added universal imitative symbols, and the next couple of subtitles is all about language, how the language developed. I think that's how Zane was talking about. In addition to emotional sounds, human at a very early date added these sounds of imitation. That is, he heard the wind through the trees, the noise of the water babbling over stones, the cries of birds and animals, and other noises of the wild. And he adopted and then adapted these sounds to convey information about the object that the sounds were associated with. The sounds that express fear, love, anger, pleasure were derived from the spontaneous expression of these emotions. And an object that commonly gave rise to an emotion might be designated by the emotion. But if there was no such emotional association, it might be designated by some sound. He gives a great example right here. Rushing water. And note how it resembles the sounds of the names given it in various languages. And these are the various languages. I can't pronounce half of those. But to rush, Rousseau, river, Rhine, all the R's.
I'd be curious to know what it was in Chinese.
It might sound the same. I don't know what the character sounds like.
Theirs is a pictographic language,
Right.
so they would
Anyway.
use some kind of a
But how would they pronounce it?
Yeah.
It would be like the interesting
how would the
thing.
language?
How would they pronounce it? The language, would be symbols, but the tracing of words to their origins is an interesting task. I love doing that. When I find out these things I'm adding, I love that. And the more we know about such origins, the more clear it becomes that there is a complete chain of association between the emotional imitative sounds used by primitive people and the words they use today. Things acquire their names through the law of association. That's a peace symbol, right? That acquired its name because they used it a lot in the 60s and 70s, right? I mean, I don't know what that symbol was before. Didn't they just make that up, or was that related to
It was an
something?
ancient symbol that was
Was it?
stylized.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. I think that's great. Well, Hitler did the same thing with his swastika.
Exactly.
He switched it around though, too, right?
And that's what happened here.
It
This
means-
was an ancient symbol
Okay.
that was stylized.
Right. But luckily we have good connotations with this, whereas the swastika was an ancient symbol of, what, life?
Yeah.
Or
Spiral of life.
Spiral of life. And then he switched it around, and now we have that bad connotation with that symbol,
Right.
even though that's not its original
However,
form.
I would say the same thing in our culture of people from the 60s of this. There are certain people my age who find that offensive.
Really?
Yes, because there was a time of great
separation,
in our culture.
Isn't that very
For some
interesting?
people,
Because
yes,
that's your,
for some
that's
people.
your, what your experiences are.
Exactly.
And is that where I wasn't living in that time. To me,
Exactly.
it's like,
So you had no
peace and
context.
love, it's all
Yeah.
good.
You had no context.
Isn't that interesting about symbols?
But
So we
those-
can't always assume that a
No.
symbol means the same thing to each person.
And those of us in the military who were fighting wars and giving our lives,
Yeah.
and that was being opposed by these
People with
so-called
that.
peaceniks. So you can see right away with just that word that a little bit
That
of my opinion.
symbol.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
Oh,
very
yeah, it's very-
interesting.
yeah.
I think that's a great
This is a
example.
good
that you
example,
give.
and it also is a good
Yeah.
example because it was a stylized image that meant love.
Right.
So it's interesting how, it became what it is
Right.
and how powerful it is.
Right. But it means something different to each person.
Yes.
The emotional
The emotional
connotation
context,
that you
right,
lay on
okay,
it.
that's right, the
Right.
emotional context, how we relate to that. Okay, you guys can't see that very well in the picture, right?
It's Bill Clinton and Al Gore.
Okay,
Oh.
does that what it sounds? This is a great example of the law of association, something in space and time that have resemblance and contiguity. I use this because in the 90s, we saw this a lot, right?
Uh-huh.
So we associated this Al Gore with Bill Clinton. This is definitely Bill Clinton, but what they did is they
That's
transferred his
someone else.
face, Clinton's face, it's actually the same face, onto Al Gore.
Interesting.
But because we see that in association,
You said Al Gore.
in contiguity,
Right. That's his hairstyle.
right, and,
Yeah.
and we've seen that image so many times that we automatically say that's Al Gore. But this is why I wanted to put that, because we found the definition of contiguity is in relationship to time and space
Right.
and our association with that.
Right.
So that's what this example was. And then I found out that this was an old definition from Aristotle, Plato and
Yeah.
Aristotle's time, which I didn't know. I was like, oh, this is great. And that's what Zane used. He wanted to use law of association. The mind having sensations and ideas which are organized by means of various associations. So, great. Okay. Through resemblance and contiguity, sensations fuse to become perceptions, perceptions join to become conceptions, and conceptions amalgamate to become reason and intuition. And that was last week's chapter. And under the influence of resemblance and contiguity through the law of association, an object acquires its name. That's a lot to say. Okay, so written language is based upon an imitative foundation. To express that a man was doing a particular thing, the simplest form of writing merely pictured the man engaged in the act. When American Indians wanted to indicate where game was abundant, they traced the trail to be followed on a conspicuous rock and crudely pictured the game to be found at the proper place along the line which mapped the trail. Such pictographs are purely imitative, as is the sound of rushing water to designate a flowing stream. But intelligent peoples were not long content to be restricted by what could thus actually be pictured. So those can give you ideas, but they can't give you a full explanation of everything, right? So he's saying that we developed more language.
You need the
because of that.
backstory.
Right. Exactly. I put this up here because symbolically pictographs is closely allied to the oldest language, that of feeling. Nowadays, because the internet is so new, we have to put some feeling attached to our words, right? Mm-hmm. We don't like just words because sometimes people can read those words very wrongly. Mm-hmm. I've discovered that. You can put just a blank statement and it seems like that person's like mad at you or something. So now we have emoticons for our internet communication. So it's like our language has to have emotion to it. Otherwise, we're not just saying words. We have to have an emotional attachment to those words. Otherwise, we don't know what the person's feeling or saying to us. Are they mad at us and they're saying it very sarcastically? Or are they saying it in reality and they're just explaining something, you know? Isn't that interesting?
Mm-hmm. Anybody who's ever tried to communicate with email has encountered that. Right? It invites them.
So, to express one thing, ancient people pictured something else, which was invariably associated with it. The spring of the year could not be pictured, but a rose, which came always with the spring, could easily be pictured. The time of year when cattle were taken to the mountains could not be pictured, but the clover on which the cattle fed could easily be drawn and came thus to be used into use to designate the summer. In the cuneiform writing of the early Sumerians, sheep were difficult to draw with little wedge-shaped marks on soft clay tablets. But 4 such marks in a rectangle made an excellent picture of a sheep pen, and when sheep were sold, they were kept in pens. And after the pen designation were placed as many wedge-shaped marks as there were sheep. Thus a record was kept of sheep bought and sold. Based on, this is the cuneiform. These were variations, as you can see as it progresses, what it symbolizes. But they had this instrument to write with, so it had to designate specific things.
So that shows the evolution of the word, say
Yes.
grain or sun.
Yeah.
Or
This
whatever.
was, I got this from, this was the cuneiform. See, the development of Mesopotamian cuneiform script. And then over time, because this is more like Chinese writing, I bet that's how Chinese language came from, right? Little dots and symbols of things. pictograph. I think so.
Yeah, but I don't think.
But they had a
it's
specific
dots.
tool. They developed a
Right.
specific tool, and they were in the Middle East, so they did this on clay tablets.
Right.
The Chinese created ink
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
brush.
and the brush.
So it wasn't so much dots, that was my objection.
Right, but the idea is the same.
Oh, yeah.
That
Yes,
from
they
an
did very
idea
soon.
come they
Mhm.
make
Yeah.
marks.
Yeah,
And
and
it
that's
was
the basis of
representative.
hieroglyphics famously. too.
Right,
Mhm.
right.
The
then-
environment. The environment created the tool
Yeah.
to be able to communicate,
Okay.
as Michael with the mud painting.
Right.
Okay, but here is the only necessary to trace it from the simple beginning as visual pictograph images to the next step, which is the visual symbolical pictograph. Yet it should be made clear at this point that pictographs and symbolical pictographs not only were the first visual images used by the race in the communication of ideas from one to another, but that because they represent obvious associations, they are the images still employed by the unconscious mind. While the words we speak and the letters we write in reality are linked historically through a long chain of association, the links in the chain mostly have been lost, like where our words come from, right? Thus, our written and spoken language has appearance of arbitrary sounds and arbitrary marks on paper. It is, in fact, a most effective tool for the expression of precise and detailed information. Yet, biologically, it is a very recent acquisition as well as a complex one. And the unconscious mind, for this reason, often finds it, the words and language, a difficult instrument to use. The unconscious mind still communicates with feelings and symbols, right?
Right.
Up to our objective consciousness so that we can form the words to communicate with somebody.
Right. Well, I think we're always, when we are introduced to a new word or concept, we're always trying to go back and find something familiar to associate it with so that you can, bring that image forward.
And I like that, like my first class, the definition of psychology was, you break it up, psyche meant soul in ancient Greek. And it means science of mind. And that's what psychology is. The definition is science of mind. And mind and soul are the same in Zane's definition. So I find that very interesting. I still find that interesting. So pictographs, however, are closely related to feeling. Many thoughts cannot be expressed merely by pictographs. It is difficult to picture energy, love, desire, ambition, thought, religion, statesmanship, and thousands of other conceptions. But through the commonly observed and recognized relations of such conceptions to things that we can picture, they can be expressed pictorially. Symbolical pictograph is the language commonly employed by the unconscious mind when feelings do not suffice. This is an old ancient Egyptian tarot that I found on the internet. I thought it was interesting.
Actually, it's not that old.
It's
a
not?
real, no, it's the Italian deck.
Oh, really?
Uh-huh.
Oh, okay.
What, 30?
No, they're recent, fairly recent.
But where did they get the Egyptian images?
Well,
Because they're
those
from our
are
deck.
those are the icon. Well, those are decks from. Those images are from back in the 30s.
30s.
No, actually before that. Saint Germain.
Oh, okay. Okay. But this deck was developed just recently,
Right.
using the old symbols.
Right.
Okay, visual and auditory images that represent thoughts are most closely allied to feelings than to arbitrary words and phrases. Symbols, therefore, are much more easily handled by the unconscious mind. Consequently, when the unconscious mind strives to communicate with objective consciousness, it may make use of feeling and or symbols. Does this seem stuff like we're rehashing the same thing we've already just said? It kind of does to me, but this is, what I've done is I followed Zane through this chapter, and what I discovered is he repeats himself and says it in various different ways to kind of get the point across. And I'm discovering this. And he starts with a long train of thought, and then at the very end, he gets to his point.
Right.
And what I've tried to do is get that point, bring it up first, and then show how he got there.
Each car.
Right. Because I don't know where he's going in the beginning. He just has a stream of thought. And I'm like, where is he going with this? And at the end, you're like, oh, okay. This is what it is, and this is how I got there. That's what I like to do. And Zane's a different way he writes. but he rehashes it over and over so that you get it. And he does that throughout his books, so that you understand what his conceptions are. Did I already read that? Symbols are, yeah.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
right, okay. Symbolical pictograph is a language commonly employed by the unconscious mind to impart information to the objective mind, which is too complex to be expressed merely as feeling. Common associations for symbols are often chosen, which are the same the world over. In this manner, regardless of changes in arbitrary speech or differences in nationality, an idea can be conveyed to any intelligent people in the world in spite of passing time. And he has that, what he's going to end up talking about is the astrology symbols. It was the understanding of this language commonly employed by the unconscious mind that led the ancient wise men to employ it to impart posterity their knowledge of occult law and spiritual verity. Instead of entrusting their wisdom to the fluctuations of arbitrary speech, they employed universal symbolical pictographs. And of course, if you find out where these symbols come from, they make sense. They come from like the ears of a ram, right? The bull, and all these things. So they have universal meanings based on physical things, and I almost think they're not emotional, not yet. I mean, unless people have a bad connotation with astrology and they see that, then they might. But in general, that is why those symbols have kept throughout time, because they're just representations of physical things. Such universal symbols were traced in the skies, the constellations, and were traced on tablets as a sacred tarot. So that's where we got. I should have put up the Zane tarot, but I was
Just go for pretty.
going to the internet. So, but see, this is the same, right? That's the same.
Yes, and that is
same
an image that
picture.
is, right. Zane got those images from someone else.
Okay. But these people, whoever made this direct, they got from the same
The
symbols,
major
right?
arcanum are the same.
Right. Right, yeah, this is the minor. This is
Right.
different. But, so,
But they all
so
come from the
those,
same source.
so, where is that source? You guys know?
Well,
Those images, what
that,
source?
well, the first time they
Be
show up
curious.
is Saint Germain
Saint
in the
Germain.
1800s, but
Okay.
he got them from someplace else.
Right.
But he kind of put that stuff together. The history is pretty unclear.
Unclear, okay.
Right.
But
That-
clearly, they go back to the images of ancient Egypt. I mean,
Right.
somebody took those.
Somebody took those.
Right, because they must be if we're all drawing the same thing. We're all coming
Right.
from the same source.
Well, you can see those images.
Right.
I mean, you can go back and see them, you know, right? Vicky?
Yeah,
Yeah.
if you
You
go
can
into
go back to
the,
Egypt and
that
go to
book,
those ancient
one of those books
things.
right behind you, the tarot book, that shows the evolution, or what we know about the evolution. of
But
different decks.
I just find it's just interesting that throughout time, these symbols have stayed the same. And we keep using them
Well,
as long as we keep them up.
I don't know whether those actual images have been around that long. I'm not sure that those images
Maybe we
were
just got them
actually
from the same
found
source.
in some sort of temple in Egypt.
I think they are, but that's my opinion.
Well,
I can't prove
and
it.
you are certainly welcome to your opinion. There's no doubt about that.
I can't prove
We
it.
just can't find
Nobody
the
can
ev-
prove it, right?
Exactly, that's the point.
Nobody can prove the
There's
original
no evidence
source.
for it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Now we're talking about the 3 dream factors.
But, you know, it's important that, you know, there is an evolution that goes on. I mean, think about
Right.
these tarot cards
Right.
that sort of started maybe with Saint Germain 1,000 years from now. I mean, they have incorporated this imagery
Right.
and stand on their own.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Because
They stand on their own.
they have an inner meaning for most people.
Right.
Yeah. It's good stuff. Okay, these are the 3 dream factors. 3 elements of dream life that need some special consideration. Because the rest of the chapter, Zane talks about this, the dream life, a little bit. So his 3 dream factors: the effect of desire, the effect of the preceding waking period and the stimulation from the external environment, and the actual experiences of the soul on the astral plane.
Yvette, can you go back one slide?
Yep.
One more? If you look at that Arcanum 6,
Yeah.
you know, if it's clearly depicted,
Yeah.
like it is on the new tarot cards where you clearly see, does anybody going to have any doubt about what the meaning of that is?
Temptation.
Well, yes. I mean,
It's being
it's
switched
what
to
convey. Maybe not the exact thing, but somebody will look at that and go, oh, here's a guy standing between. Right.
Right.
But
And it
it's
could
a
be a woman
cultural,
standing between two men, it would mean the
It could be
same
the
thing.
same, exactly.
Exactly.
It could be.
It means that there's two ways you
You know,
can
maybe
go.
one guy's no good looking and the other guy looks like smart or something, you know?
But
One guy has
that's
money and-
culturally
Right, one has money and
And
the
one
other
has
guy's
intelligence.
holding a surfboard.
I think our interpretation of this is automatically culturally conditioned by the fact that our culture doesn't accept polygamy. We read that as an imperative to choose between this or that. And in many cultures, it wouldn't necessarily, it could be a both-and thing instead of an either-or thing. There's
Right.
many different ways
But it's
that could be
representative
interpreted.
of our culture.
Right.
It's our culture, right? That's what you're saying.
I'm
That's
saying
exactly-
our interpretation is conditioned by our cultural
Exactly.
upbringing.
But do you not think having to make choices is a universal thing?
It
though?
can be choices not
Sure,
even just about people.
but that
it can just
picture
be
might not
choices.
mean that to other people.
No, but
If we're fine to have a concubine in your culture, they wouldn't read that as you have to choose between this and that.
They read it as happiness.
It could have different
well, you know,
connotations.
But then you have to look at his expression on his face. It's not happiness.
Right.
Right? You have to find an
but there's
emotional
still a
context.
choice there, Laura.
Right. Right.
You may decide, is it the first wife or is it the you know, there's still that choice there that could be implied. And also, the
It could
important
be.
thing really is the culture supplies the emotion for the image, right? So it is culturally based.
Yeah.
And the unconscious mind uses those cultural images
Right.
when it has a dream. It doesn't use images from some other culture.
Right. Exactly.
And also-
what makes sense to you in your
Right,
mind.
exactly.
We're
There's
drawing,
another component to that image too, though. It's not just the fork in the road and that choice. There's a whole other component up there.
Is
It's
it
like
this
when
guy?
you make a choice, it usually closes the door to the other side. And that there is a big, there's a larger world of consideration.
Well, there's a
In
big
the choices.
consequence. if you
Or
make
there's
the
a
wrong
con,
choice.
yeah.
There's a
right.
consequence. That's the main thing.
Yeah.
There's some
I don't think
consequence.
there is a wrong choice. I think there's
Yeah.
just a choice for
Well,
you to make
It,
your
it
own
becomes a
self.
point.
Yeah.
It becomes a point
Yeah.
Right.
of reference.
Right.
And then there is a consequence. So your choice is always a point of reference.
The
Right.
The road's
Because
not taken.
Later on down the road, you're going to come
And you're
across the
gonna go.
same thing, and based on your previous experiences, you say, well, that was a good choice last time, so I'm going to make it again.
Right.
Or that was a bad choice last time, I didn't like the consequences, so I'm going to make a different choice. this
Right.
See, and there's the two paths there. You know,
Right.
it's which,
You can
it's
go
the
two
road
paths.
not taken. Whatever road is taken has consequences different. than
And
the
he
other.
is
Either right
poised.
or wrong.
Right, right in the middle. He's making the decision, he hasn't made the decision yet.
Right.
He's thinking about it.
I think what you're objecting to, though, Laura, is the fact that it's two women, two.
Oh,
No,
the
she was
image
saying
that
that
you
different
use-
cultures have different.
that's right.
Symbols.
And that we are so deeply imprinted with our own cultural point of view that we are not free to look at an Egyptian image and even see it as though the Egyptians might have seen it.
Sure.
We've drawn Egyptian imagery into our culture and then glommed our preference or insistence upon monogamy and our emotional associations with polygamy right on top of it so that we may not get other possibilities of what that card might mean. When I was taught to read the tarot, I was taught that the lovers meant that the key word for the lovers, the key feeling, that which you desire most.
Well, yeah,
Well, that's
he has
a
to make
whole-
a
But that's the
decision.
same
what he
thing.
decides
That's exactly
most.
what
On the other hand, when you put temptation over that, it can
That's
really
a word.
skew that which
Exactly.
you desire
Yes.
most and make it a moral teaching and a path of sinning
That becomes a
and
word.
a whole karmic, ramification.
But
And that's
Laura,
all included in our interpretations of the card.
But it's the
You know?
same thing. It's exactly the same. There's no difference in what you said. They're the same thing. That it's the idea. It's the whole idea of making choices. Every culture has the same thing. They have what you desire most. They're attracted to. They have temptations. They have rules. They have morals. Mores and folkways,
That's
and
what
they have to make
socializing
decisions
is about.
what path to go down.
Right.
Every culture has to do that.
Right. So, one culture might teach what you should do is follow your heart, and another culture might teach, oh, you should be very suspicious of that which gets your lusts all up, and
Sure.
so it's very complex.
Mhm.
And it's not a simple thing to look at imagery and know how to interpret a card. I mean, it varies from reading to reading,
Well, it
much
doesn't,
less from culture to culture.
doesn't that card, it doesn't tell you which way to go, it just tells you that you're coming at a crossroads, right? That card never
That's
tells you,
another
cards
way it
never
can
tell
be
you what you
interpreted.
should be doing.
Well,
I don't think so. They tell you what's coming up, and it's for you to make your own decision, right? Isn't that what a card reading is? Make your own decision. It's not supposed to tell you, oh, you're going to do this,
it
this, and this.
depends on the card reader.
I guess so. It does.
Are about telling you what to do.
Venus is that, and that's a Venus card.
Right.
And Venus is about emotions. So probably what that card is communicating to you is that you have an emotional attachment to. You're going to be encountering a choice
Right.
for which you have an emotional attachment to one aspect of it, and you're probably going to have a quandary over which way to go. That's what you're going to have
That's
feelings
another
about it.
possible interpretation. There's so many layers to this, and they're all
There is.
legitimate.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons it's so rich to study symbolism.
Yes.
Right, yes.
Exactly.
We get
Yes,
all those
yes.
layers accessible
Right.
to us.
Right,
Exactly.
exactly. Symbols are many layers. Absolutely agree with
Good,
that.
good point.
Yeah.
Yes, very good point.
Okay, 3 dream factors. So yeah, we're going to do a lot of talking because I have an hour left and I'm halfway through my slideshow. So. So anyway, so we'll have a lot of discussion when there's another slide coming up, but I think we'll have a lot of discussion on. So anyway, well, I'll keep reading. There are 3 elements. I already read this one, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, wait, I wish for the review. What could the effect of desire, the effect of preceding waking period?
And the stimulation from the external environment. Those things have an effect on your dream life.
Desire,
That's what he's talking
environment, and experience on the astral plane.
about. Yes,
Okay.
that's what he's saying. That's what Zane is saying.
Thank you.
This is, our subtitles is number 1. So of course we had to have a definition. Desire. Zane's definition are energies in a state of tension within the thought structure of the astral body. A dictionary definition: to wish, to long for, to crave, to want. I like this picture because it was an empty tin of chocolates, and Zane is the state of tension. So it's like, there's tension here. You want the chocolate, but there's nothing there. It's just a heart-shaped box. I thought it was a great example of desire.
Builds up the desire.
And that's symbolical, right?
Yeah.
It's very symbolical.
Yeah.
But we kind of,
Yeah.
All right. Physical stimuli and desire energy, which are ever straining for release, tend to attract one's attention. This type of attention is called spontaneous attention because it was not decided beforehand to focus the attention on any specific thing. The energy of a desire tends toward release in a particular kind of action. All action, in fact, is due to desire energy being released. Desire can find expression not merely in physical activity, but also in mental activity as well. The difference between directed thinking and fantasy thinking must be known to understand the effect of desire upon the dream experiences. So the definition of directed thinking is thinking with the attention directed by volition, which is the act of choosing. The attention is also usually directed to actual conditions, the effort being made that the images shall stand in their natural relation to each other without distortion. That is, directed thinking is a careful attempt to reproduce reality. I had a little bit of a problem with that because can't you make your thinking directed in a way that doesn't reproduce reality? something we desire,
Mhm.
focus on it. It's not in reality yet.
Do you suppose in his, in the context of how he's defining it though, that's the essential point? That
Maybe.
as opposed to some fantasy,
Okay.
directed thinking becomes useful when you use it to solve real problems or
Yeah.
define what you perceive to be reality.
Right. The attention, I like this, the attention directed by your choosing, when you're directing it into, as opposed to the spontaneous attention where you're just jumping all over the place, which happens to everybody. Right? Directed thinking quickly uses up energy. It is a process of psychic assimilation that consumes much vitality and leaves the system correspondingly exhausted. It is very hard to have your thinking directed for a very long time. It's like meditation. It's very hard to do.
And
Spontaneous things keep coming up all the time.
and on real problems, because
Right.
those real problems
Real
keep getting you
problems.
feedback.
Right.
Like, this is not
And-
working.
and if
you
we're
have to
like-
go back and try it again.
If we're at a job all day, right, and our thinking is directed towards this job that we might hate, we're exhausted by the end of the day, right? We're mentally exhausted. So, in other words, there are no harder work in the world and none more useful than directed thinking.
I think as it becomes a habit, it gets easier and easier and doesn't require so much effort of us.
Right.
Is it
Meditation
possible,
helps.
though, that it does take its toll on your organs? That directed thinking, if it's clear, can be very energizing. Directed thinking that has threads of stress can then take a toll on its organs, which we're kind of finding.
Yeah.
And there needs to be a more focused and clear
Relaxation.
definition of directed thinking. And directed thinking,
Well, maybe
as
it-
Zane characterizes it, is the approach of thoughts, feelings, and emotions that are discordant. And I love that, because you can direct think, as you just gave the example of a job you hate, and you are exhausted. However, people who love what they're doing are
Right.
energized, and that's
Yes.
the best definition, I feel, of Zane. He's the only person out there that I know of that clearly has a definition of how you think and direct and focus that benefits you and others, because it's totally creative and inspirational. So,
It strikes me that, I don't know, my background in Eastern philosophy wants to wed itself with this in the sense of, if we would include non-action, non-doing, no need to, make an effort to make something happen ourselves in the idea of directed thinking, that it could become much more user-friendly. We could be using the flow of the way things are, and they call it wu-wei, non-action, where nothing remains undone. Everything just gets done because you're in the flow, and it's then it's not so ego-driven and so little self. It's plugging into a great big thing and allowing the
But
great
with
big
that,
thing to
however,
inform your
yes,
directed
but what you're
thinking.
saying is
Yeah.
pleasure. If you love what you're doing, you are.
Right.
You are plugged in to something that's good for you and others, and you are in the universal flow, and therefore directed thinking would be doing that.
I think your directed thinking, though, is, jeez, I just had it. And I lost it. Just as something you were saying that, just lost it.
It'll come back.
I know it was. My thinking a couple years ago was directed towards a lot of distraction in my life. Go out, have fun, party. I wanted to direct my thinking more towards the spiritual, higher ideals. I had to direct my thinking in that direction. Even though when I come into this direction, it's exactly what you were saying. What I find out is I have to allow more, I call it God. I allow more God in me, receptive to God. But my thinking had to be directed in that area because I wanted it to. So I did have to use energy and direct it, but now, because I've done it so much where I keep bringing my thinking back to the spiritual, now it's become habitual.
Cool.
And now it's easier, so that directed thinking isn't a lot of energy, it's good, but that's where I had to direct it first to make it into a habit. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying, but you also have to direct where you want your thinking to go. So I think that's directed thinking, right?
Very nice. Well said.
All right. And now we have to talk about fantasy thinking. The process by which mental images uncurbed by the critical faculties are permitted to be expressed. Fantasy thinking takes very little effort. Fantasy thinking, an imaginative sequence, especially when desires are fulfilled, a daydream.
May I give an example when I read
Yes.
this?
Yes.
And it was so very clear to me because I happen to know someone that when I first met this person would talk about what they were going to do. And then they never did it. Well, I can't understand it. If you're going to talk about something, you really need to do it. And so as I continued to know this person, I realized when I read Zane that what was happening was the available energy was being used up in a fantasy way, and that was it. And so it was fantasy thinking rather than directed thinking. And I just love this because I had this person in my life at the time. And that was the perfect example of that.
Right, and that's one of the reasons that it's a basic tenet of magic to keep silence about your intentions. Don't dissipate the energy
Which he talks
before
about,
it
yes.
actually gets into the flow of manifesting. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. So daydreaming and dreaming in sleep are similar processes. The difference is chiefly in how much consciousness is influenced by the awareness of external conditions. To the extent the attention is completely withdrawn from the objective world, does the attention more and more become absorbed in fantasy images? That could be true. I don't know.
That's a good question.
But yeah, you can see some people that are so absorbed in their fantasy thoughts, they're not in the objective world very well. They're not doing things very well. They're in their head thinking about all these things that they want to do. And we can even say that too with the future, things that we want to do. That's kind of fantasy thinking, right? And we're not kind of conscious and focused on what we're doing all the time, you know? Right?
Is the objective world, according to Zane, the present?
Yeah, well,
I mean, that's
Well,
just
it's
the
the world is
term.
the
It's
physical.
the thing that you do, that you
Everyday
define as
world.
you go through life, when you, like, you know whether what you're doing is being effective in realizing your goals.
Your environment?
Your goal. Well, how you learn to interact with that environment. If you don't learn to read your environment correctly, you're not going to get the results back that you're looking for. Are you?
No, and if you go the next step was saying, if you don't learn to adapt and read your environment, you die. So, if you move more and more from the objective world and become absorbed in fantasy images,
I think fantasy, can be, I don't know.
A nice diversion.
Yeah.
But then you have to know that it's fantasy.
You have to
differentiate.
manipulate future thoughts of that's a fantasy thinking because it's not happening to you right now.
It's
And you're not focused in the objective world. Like driving a car, you can be kind of half there driving a car because your own thoughts are like either, in
Right.
fantasy thinking or whatever, You're not always focused in that.
And you don't have to be
I know.
because it's such a habituated activity.
Right, exactly.
So it sets
Can
the
be a little
mind free to
conscious.
travel.
And he talks more about this. The physical world seems to cease to exist in daydreaming. So long as the physical brain registers a recognizable consciousness of the physical environment, it may be said to be awake. But when fantasy thinking so absorbs the attention that few impressions received from the objective consciousness are greatly distorted, the physical brain is said to be asleep. Now, I had a problem with this at first. But then I thought, well, maybe that's true. I don't know.
I can say my experience after 50 years with someone who seems to be able to do fantasy thinking when I'm trying to bring back to objective consciousness. I would say there's asleep. My experience is wake up, right here, right now.
Right, because it's almost like all the other processes are going on, like you become habitual in certain things, but your mind is so involved in the fantasy that it almost seems like they're asleep. There's things you can do in your sleep, right? You can walk. I've talked in my sleep when I was little. My mother used to have a conversation with me, and I had no idea what the heck. I was oblivious to the environment. I was oblivious to her in consciousness, and yet I had a conversation with her. That's sleepwalking. So I guess that can happen, right?
Well, it's that fantasy goer is that, because I walked and talked in my sleep, and when I came to Zen, it made sense that somewhere consciousness is always expressing. We may not understand consciousness expressing because we have this specific point of reference, but isn't that what the astral is? Isn't that where
yes, that's where my mind
consciousness goes to the
Well, I
astral?
have a question. Is fantasy necessarily imagination?
That I
Is a-
separate
is
the
a-
two,
is
but
a-
that's
Yeah,
how I
Let's talk a
understand
little
it.
bit about the creative imagination kind of being different than fantasy thinking.
I think fantasy
what I
might be
understood.
more like, it's what, you're having a problem with something, kids do it a lot, that, engage in fantasy thinking. You're having problems with something, and so for a diversion, you go out and create this fantasy world to operate in. And you're actively creating it.
Yes.
It's not really solving your problem that you have over here as a child with getting along with somebody or whatever, but it sure felt good for a time. But when you wake up, you do have to go back over, and if you want to get along with other children, you have to change your behavior.
So is there a difference where for instance, Einstein always put himself in a state where he felt that he was simply he didn't call it fantasizing, but he was in a state that was unconscious, but he directed it for a problem, and then he was in the state.
Yes.
I think that's different.
Yes, than fantasy.
Right.
Yes.
And Zane does talk about that.
Yes.
It's on one of the slides as we go. So yes, definitely. He does say creative imagination is one thing and fantasy thinking is another. So the thought cells and thought structures of the astral body never cease interacting with each other, and their stored energies are always straining for release. Those thought cells' stored energies, which find some measure of expression, become the focus of the attention. Or as a laboratory psychologist would put it, every person at all times has trains of thought passing through their mind. If a particular desire is rather completely realized in the daily life, it has released its energy and thus finding satisfaction. Once it releases its energy in fulfillment, it no longer has much energy to spend. That fulfilled desire then has little power to attract the attention and little energy to have an influence upon the dream life, therefore is not apt to be profound. So once we've fulfilled a fantasy thought, it doesn't have any energy anymore left to in that direction, unless you create another fantasy in that same direction, and then you want, which happens, and then people have addictions.
Yes, I have a
Because they
question,
keep wanting
because
more and
what
more
we are
and more.
finding, and I'll use the vampire, those books, is there seems to be a need, a desire need to have fantasy,
Played out?
stimulation through reading that's played out vicariously. Now, does that leave little energy for other activities? Does it stimulate other activities? But this would seem to say that if you spend your fantasy dime, then it's done and it will not play itself in dreams.
Right. And
that
I think
what it
that's what
says?
he's saying, and that's kind of true. I think he's kind of getting to the point of what comes into your dreams, is what he's kind of getting at. And he's saying if you have a strong desire, at night when you dream and you remember your dream, you might play out that desire in the dreams. And so that's going to affect your dreams. And he's basically talking about what affects our dreams. But if you have a fantasy that gets fulfilled that day, that night that you dream, you're not going to dream about that fantasy anymore because it was fulfilled. So that energy is kind of spent up.
Now, this
I
may
think that's what he's
be
talking about.
premature. I do know that before I came to Zen, I had a very unhappy situation relative to my mother with thought forms and feelings. And I nursed my mother and took care of my mother, and it was duty. And I completely and totally fooled myself that the desire that I had relative to thought for mother was done, because after she died, I dreamed successively for several months of physically beating her up.
Wow.
And I always know when I'm dreaming and when I'm awake and can kind of direct it. And I would wake up and I would think, well, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Now, how good and how beneficial to me that now I know I really still hadn't completed what I needed to have, but it didn't hurt anybody.
Yeah. Right.
I didn't need to feel guilty. I didn't
Right.
need to have to move. Now, is that premature to the next piece of this? Does Zane speak to that in dreams? Can you fulfill a desire or an emotion in a discordant fashion?
Yes.
And
that's
then
what he
it
says.
satisfies
fantasy
the
thinking.
desire.
That's what he says.
And would that be fantasy thinking?
Yes, and that's what he says.
Yeah.
And he
That's
says
what the modern
energy.
psychology
Psychology.
of dreams says, that you work out a lot of
These
problems in your dreams.
within that.
It actually tends to work out problems. So
Yes, absolutely. And he does talk about if you can spend that desire energy in fantasy thinking, and that energy kind of dissipates. He doesn't specify if it's all the energy, just like a fulfilled fantasy, or is it just some of it? I don't know. He doesn't specify, but he does say that the desire energy can be fulfilled physically, or it can mentally through fantasy thinking. He
It
does say that.
sounds like Shirley was able to discharge the energy
Right.
by acknowledging it and
Yes.
and owning what was going on there.
That's a lot of
Wow.
what
yeah.
this page is about. in
Yeah.
fact.
Yeah, that,
Okay, let's read it.
Right.
We will learn later that attention reinforces the energy of desire, and that action is always in the direction of the strongest release of desire energy. In the waking state, the desire to conform to civilized standards is usually stronger than the desire to follow more primitive impulses. Physical action, therefore, is governed by the proper amount of restraint. But restraint does not dispose of the energy of desire. That's what you're talking about. It merely prevents the energy under tension from breaking through and turning into action. The energy is still there, however, ever striving for release.
and when I read Zen, I thought, how interesting that energy, which I was new to the whole concept of energy.
Yeah.
I really felt for the first time that energy is always straining from release. Here,
Yes.
there, anywhere.
Exactly.
And focus for energy, straining for release, is choice. Back to that card.
Right.
And your experience is your consequence.
Well, very often
Good or
our
bad.
unconscious choice will be balanced and vented by our what
By
we
your
repressed. Yeah.
Right.
So your
So
dreams
that kind of,
could be extremely healing, but that you could vent that energy in a safe and needed way.
Way.
Yeah.
Desire. Yeah.
in a non-action way.
Right.
In a non-physical action way.
Right. So there's desire which restrains other powerful desires from expressing themselves in physical action. However, it is not uncommon for people to permit themselves in their imagination to do things they certainly would
And
not
when I
do
read that, I thought,
physically.
oh, that's it.
As a matter of fact, if a person were able to express these fantasies in physical life, there would be no need for them to use up the energies of these desires in fantasy thinking. Because the desires cannot be realized in physical action does not destroy their energy.
Okay.
The energy is still there, straining for release, but he's talking about physical action. And if the desire is powerful enough, we may be sure that sooner or later it will find some way of escape. Mostly in our thoughts, right? The dissipation of daydreaming. This is a cartoon that I like.
What is this?
I'm in a deep philosophical mood today. Thoughts of life and destiny fill my mind.
Or shiny jewelry!
I love watching on the trash truck. And this is called being 5. So I love it. That's the dissipation of daydreaming, right?
Us children.
Reality. Reality comes by and says, oh, yeah.
Those trash trucks are fascinating.
Okay, so then the dissipation of daydreaming, bearing in mind that it is only those desires which have not found fulfillment in objective life, which retain their energy, and that the energy of these unfulfilled desires, whatever it may be, is ever straining to find expression. It is easy to perceive that these are the desires which most influence fantasy. Not able to release their energies in physical action, they release in finding imaginary realization. If the desire is such as to afford the possibility of realization, and that such realization would be beneficial, the best method of using the energy of the desire is to direct it into those actions which tend to overcome the obstacles and thus lead on to its fulfillment. If instead the energies of the desire are permitted to be fantasies, in which the realization is attained only in the imagination, this may afford a substitute satisfaction. So,
This is what I would say, that often people who want to be a musician and become famous, and what happens is that they don't ever become famous.
They use it all up in imagination. They use all that energy.
Yes, it could go that way, but where I was going to go is it becomes their avocation rather than their vocation, and that's a substitution.
It is.
That they come to relative to this desire nature. However, objective consciousness
And
is
reality,
and
the real
reality.
world.
Yes, and I love that Zane gave away that was positive. That you could have both. That you needed to live in a real world.
Right.
You also could still have these desires as a substitution that didn't rob your satisfaction, because he says satisfaction's the deal. So,
Yeah. That's great. But fantasy thinking uses up energy which should be directed to some actual accomplishment. This is what he's talking about, the creative. The individual who finds great pleasure in imaginary accomplishment to that extent decreases the energy of his command for actual accomplishments. So I think that's kind of just what Shirley was saying. If you're constantly fantasizing about doing something, becoming something, but you never actually put into action any of that, then you're just going to use up all that energy in imagination. I've done that. It's been lots of times in an imaginary thought, and it never comes to fruition because I've never directed my energy into it. I've always just thought about it, imagine it. So he has drained his desires without getting concrete results.
Isn't that kind of what we were talking about this morning with Mercury?
yes.
Yeah.
Is that whole notion that you got to think really long and hard before you commit yourself to something,
Right.
because it's going to take a lot of effort to move it there.
Right, exactly. And to the extent satisfaction is found in such imaginary situations is their lack of ability to attain satisfaction in the realm of reality. Fantasy thinking dissipates energy in useless inner experiences which are negative. I don't think he means negative as opposed to bad. In my mind, when he said negative, it means just as opposed to positive, which is radiating, negative is receptive. That, in my mind, it's like a negative
And
energy.
I agree, but I really feel that this is something that needs an addendum.
Yeah.
Yes,
I
it
believe that
does.
Church of Life
Explanation.
people would understand that, but
Right.
taken out of context, that
Some people would say, "Oh, it's a bad thing to do." No, it's not. It's
Right.
just. It's
That's why I
more
said he comes
receptive
from a
thing.
scientific background, and anybody who studied electricity or chemistry, they understand positive and negative, and not being a good or bad thing.
Right.
It's just it has to do with the power of attraction
Yeah.
or repulsion.
I wonder though, people like me who came to this, who didn't have that context, it would be really good to have an addendum that moved you back to, this is where
Right.
this came from, this is this thought form relative to this conclusion, and it's based upon this formula.
Right.
Yes. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Yes,
say-
no, that's
negate what you
good.
said.
No, that's good, because I do believe that that's important.
Well,
And what was said
you
this
know,
morning was important.
It's so hard for us to judge the quality of fantasy thinking too, when, for instance, we are ensconced in a disintegrating, dysfunctional, non-sustainable paradigm in our culture right now. We need visionary thinkers who are not conditioned by having to think within the box. You know, our laws of economy are not God-given laws, they're man-made
Right.
creations.
Absolutely.
So we need people who can think outside of that, you know, conditioned, locked in, this is, quote, reality, and come up with whole new visions of things that might be more effective.
Okay,
man-made
But that's
creations.
directed thinking.
Yes,
That's
that's-
not fantasy.
that's
Right,
right.
That's
but
visionary
the two
thinking
have
is
to be
directed
wedded, is what I'm thinking here. You know, in order to
Creative
think
imagination.
outside the box, we have to have access to fantasy thinking. Granted, it may eventually have practical application or not. A lot of ideas will just have to be trashed as not doable, but that whole idea of brainstorming, of coming up with ideas where you're not going, yeah, but that won't work in the real world because,
Yeah.
you know, what if only, it won't work, you know, we have to set that aspect of our inner critic aside in order to truly access visionary thinking, which is, I would
Right.
say, a form of fantasy thinking.
Well, I don't think that's what.
He talks
I
about
mean
creative
by
imagination.
That's
He
what
says
it's
that's
saying,
what he
What
talks
you're
about.
talking about
It's
is
something
pretty
different.
important.
Yeah.
Right
That's
there.
directed
Directed thinking.
That's working to come up with
Well,
new ideas.
Well,
People
that's
sit
the
around the
agenda,
table.
Shirley,
Yes.
that I'd like to add
Right here.
to that.
Creative
right?
imagination brings images together in various combinations and live vividly in the astral realm, but does not find complete satisfaction. Or it's like, creative imagination should be used to get ideas, to formulate plans, to perceive how things the better may be done. So he's distinguishing creative imagination from fantasy. But I see it can be similar.
Yes.
But he's saying that fantasy thinking is more,
that needs crossing
and then
over.
creative imagination gets you where better things can be done.
Yeah.
He said it before when we talked about the word. He's saying that fantasy thinking is a negative thing. It
Right.
leaves you
Sucks your
depleted.
energy.
Right.
Yeah, it leaves you depleted. You don't have energy left to do anything with it.
Uh-huh.
Because you've spent it in your
Right.
fantasy.
I have to go back because this is because we were jumping to it, so I so the title was The Dissipation of Daydreaming.
But you know, there is a gray area there.
Yeah.
With Laura.
Yes,
said.
Exactly.
absolutely,
Where you, from
absolutely.
fantasy thinking, you get some ideas.
Yeah,
that
I mean,
lead
maybe-
into creative.
And in terms of these
Right,
social
absolutely.
problems, maybe we don't know till 50 years, 100 years down the road, which were the useful ideas and which were dissipation.
Right?
However, discernment, intelligent discernment would be part of this process.
Right.
Sure.
And you would
Yeah.
magnetize, would you not?
Yeah.
Like thinking minds, possibly,
Yeah.
for these.
Yeah.
Think tanks.
Right.
But I'm afraid most of our think tanks are conditioned by thinking that the laws of economy were God-given laws.
Or they,
They're man-made.
their pocketbook is they're hard to separate the pocketbook from.
So the dissipation
idea.
of daydreaming, when a desire, as in a fantasy thinking and daydreaming, is permitted to be used up and attain its satisfaction in imaginary conditions. Satisfaction in such imaginary accomplishment should not be confused with the use of imagination creatively. We just talked about that, right?
Yeah. Wow, we were on the same wavelength.
Right.
Dang.
It is true that many desires in their original form should not be permitted expression, but they each represent so much energy that can be made available for real accomplishment, and means can be devised by which such energy can be diverted into channels that lead to worthwhile results. The desires create and build first on the astral plane that they may have a correct pattern to follow when they express externally. We have to think about the things first, so we have to have the creative imagination first. We have to have like the fantasy thinking, and then creative imagination, which I already went through already. Mental processes are not disconnected images, but trains of thought, one image joined to the preceding image through the law of association. and that in the analysis of what occurs during any sleeping state, if it can be completely remembered, there will be happenings which have been definitely suggested by and have their origin from something which entered the mind before the period of sleep. This factor, therefore, in dream interpretation, even though represented in symbolical form, should not be given some other significance.
In my dream group, they call it day residue.
Yes,
Oh,
exactly.
Yeah.
that's good.
And these,
In psychology, I think they call it.
Day residue.
and recognition of occurrences witnessed from the astral planes.
That's a cool image.
Yeah, isn't it? Space, the final frontier.
A train of asteroids like a mother ducky and
Whoa! The environment encroached in. What will I do?
The astral body possesses sense organs by which it can acquire information from the astral plane, in the same way that physical sense organs can be used to acquire information on the physical plane. Furthermore, the astral body during sleep is not chained to the physical, but has the power to move it to distant parts and there to perceive what is taking place. In the astral body, if one can raise or lower their usual general vibratory rate, one can even travel to higher or lower planes than that of its usual vibratory level. He's saying that in your dreams you can go to different levels. Okay. One is almost as free to move from plane to plane or from one region on a given plane to another region on that plane, as is a disincarnate soul. And I wrote, isn't that called astral travel?
Yeah.
An astral form can communicate with disincarnate entities or persons on that plane in the usual manner of conversation. And within certain limits, the astral form can tune in sufficiently to pick up information being broadcast from one plane while actually on another plane. In other words, even as on the physical plane during the waking state, the acquisition of physical information is limited only by the ability of the individual. So the acquisition of information from the astral plane during sleep is limited not by impassable barriers, but by the lack of individual training and initiative. So you go on the internet on the astral plane to check out all the information on the astral, right?
Well, it does have a vibratory rate, I'm sure.
They have an internet over there too, right? It is not something most can do without some training to direct their attention during sleep to the acquisition of information. Since birth, all training has been toward keeping the attention riveted to the physical avenues of knowledge. Yet the astral world is open to inspection during sleep, and its entities are there to be contacted almost as readily as they are there after passing from the physical body. And through directing the attention to acquiring knowledge from such sources during sleep, much value can be brought back into waking consciousness, not merely that has already happened or is in existence, but also regarding that which will happen in the future. So he's saying you can get information in the astral, in your dreams, about talking to other entities, about finding out what's going to happen in the future, etc., etc. Wish fulfillment. Don't we all wish we could do that? Okay. And I love these paintings. I'm so glad I could get them off the internet. I love them. Okay. Except when some unusual stimulus intrudes, the state of relaxation favors fantasy thinking, especially that which precedes sleep. Even without losing objective consciousness, if we close the eyes and relax the body in an easy position, the mind, no longer having its attention directed to reality, tends to drift into a world of the imagination. It does. In such a state, as well as in sleep, one thing suggests another, and this suggests something else. And if there isn't in thought structure of the unconscious mind some strong unfulfilled desire, the energy of this desire, straining for release, soon captures the attention. That is, the energy of such an unrealized desire, straining for release, is sufficient stimulus that it attracts the attention. The trains of thought passing through the unconscious mind are led to this desire because it is making so much disturbance, or it has energy. A foot uncovered during sleep, if it gets duly cold, attracts the attention. The fantasy images are led to include this coldness in their symbolism. This may bring dreams of sleigh riding or the Arctic, or when our alarms go off, that incorporates into our dream, and we're like, how do you get this sound to stop in my dream? And in the same way, the stimulus of an unfulfilled desire brings the fantasy images passing through the mind to include and symbolize it. A desire is energy seeking release, and it finds this release in the fantasies of the dream. So maybe that's where the energy is going in the dream state. I love that picture. The Northern Lights.
Yeah,
He was talking about a foot being cold, so I thought, oh, I'll put this in. I'll just put it. But opposed to the crude, even though natural methods of expression, there may be the rigid censorship of the civilized desires. Thus, the energy of the unfulfilled desires are to express, even in fantasies of dreams, they must conceal their true identities under various symbolic disguises. It's true. The images are subject to condensation, displacement, and various other processes, which nevertheless, when viewed with an understanding of the symbolical pictograph, fail to conceal their true significance from one attempting to interpret them. 89. Ooh, almost done. Dream interpretation. Now, I feel there's only two sides about dream interpretation. So all of that he was talking about what interjects in the dream life. And then, in my opinion, doesn't say much about dream interpretation. In the interpretation of dreams, the effort should be made to separate and interpret, each according to its own type of significance, the three various factors of the dream life. The happening of the previous waking state, that is the link between waking consciousness and the dream, should be sorted out and given recognition as possessing this function only. Then the unfulfilled desires, especially the one which at the time is strongest, should be sought and given its proper evaluation, for it also commonly finds symbolic expression in the dream. Finally, there often is information of real value to the individual gained from the inner plane. The best manner to learn to recognize this factor is to remember the dreams and correlate their happenings to the events that shortly come into the life. Through such cultivation, dreams can be made to possess great value.
We'll all dream of you.
So we can just talk for the next 20 minutes, since we got 20 minutes left.
Sure.
Do you want to just converse? I don't know. I had interesting thought. Where was it? Oh, here it is. Do you guys just mind if I read this?
No, no,
Okay. What emotion do you have when you have a fulfilled desire or fantasy? What emotion do you have? Have you ever really wanted something? Like I remember when I was little, I really wanted to go to Disney World. Really, 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 really bad. That was like my one desire. And when I was 14, my dad lived in Florida, and I finally got to go. Of course, it was, I was just in awe and loved it. But then there was all these other issues and problems along with it, of course. Like my dad didn't want to go to everything. I only had one day. I couldn't see everything. Of course, I was in awe when I was there, but then afterwards, it was almost like a deflation, right?
Yeah.
Have you ever had that?
Similar in that I had a great, great desire for Chanel. And I have a big desire nature.
Who are you?
I still am. And I'm always very aware of my desires, and then I categorize them, and I figure out what can and what can't. And I had always read philosophy and religion that when the desire is satisfied,
Right.
there is no more desire. And I experienced that. I knew that the value of having this object was the whole point.
Right.
Because when it was given to me by I was working and everybody chipped in, and I knew that to buy this very expensive thing, they all didn't sacrifice, but they really wanted me to have it. I gave just a little bit. Bob gave a whole lot. And then I had it, and I liked it, and it was great, but I no longer needed to have it.
Right.
And that was the first time that I had experienced there does come a time on this earth plane when you have all of your desires as much as possible satisfied the same word, because that was the first time, I was involved with saying, it was the first time I knew what satisfaction felt like. It was a balanced feeling. Wasn't a neutral
How long did it
feeling.
last? Not very long.
No, still. I mean, I had fulfilled that. Whatever that was, which had
Right.
nothing to do with the object.
Right.
And it was a balanced feeling. It wasn't a terribly happy feeling or a disappointed
Right.
feeling.
Isn't it
It was
like-
a balanced, satisfied feeling.
But
And
it
that was
never
good.
lasts.
Of
And
course
I-
not, because desires continue to arise to be fulfilled.
And I think that's what addiction is shopping addiction.
Mhm.
Is you get that thing you think, and then you have that feeling at the end like, oh, I'm not satisfied. I want more. I have to get more. I have to have more. I have to get more. You know what I mean? So an addiction can arise if you don't realize there it is, satisfaction, balance. Now I can move with something else.
I can
But some
attach.
people can go, wait a minute, I'm not satisfied. I had that huge desire. I'm done, satisfied, but I'm not done. And that's why I think we find addictions is because people are continually looking for this wonderful feeling that they don't get from that one desire fulfilled. They're not getting it because you know why? It's a physical thing, and our inner happiness does not come from physical things we discover as we go in life, right? It comes from, you know what? I think most people can, I don't know, see if you guys agree. Most things come from when you're giving to somebody else and you're getting nothing in return. I find the most inner happiness comes when I'm doing that. I don't know, like if you have children, right? Giving to your children freely, giving to somebody for Christmas, giving, when you don't have to have anything come back to you. I feel the most satisfaction in that. I don't know.
Well, I think that when you can
Inner
detach,
satisfaction.
when you detach your own personal feelings from, when you give a gift and it's truly a gift,
Right.
and you release, I mean, you recognize that.
Isn't that more of a wonderful feeling than
If you
getting
have-
the physical thing that you thought you desired all your life? Once you got that, you're like, huh.
If you have expectation attached to desire, that's where the problem is.
Maybe that's what it is.
The expectation, which is experience, can then, the consequence of having a desire and an expectation attached to the desire is when the desire actually is fulfilled, what you learn is what your expectation was. And it can go either way.
Right.
And that's when you really learn, and perhaps, because you're right, the expectation is, it's a physical thing.
Right.
And physical things are illusions of sorts.
Exactly.
But it's that expectation, and it's just wonderful to watch desires, and then you learn what your expectation is, and then you go, well, I was really repressing that. Or no one can fulfill my desire because no person can ever live up to an expectation because human beings, so I just find that an interesting formula that I use.
I have an experience that may be an example of how a desire can morph into something. And this is a child, when you asked that question, I thought, I don't have anything, and all of a sudden this popped into my mind.
Okay.
I remember when I was a kid seeing on Disney World or the TV programs that they had about the Disney World, and these little cars. Do you remember the cars that would drive, the motor cars that would drive? They had like little highways and
They were
you could
physical,
drive.
they were real cars.
They were
Like
real
go-karts?
cars, and it's like Autotopia, I think is what the name of that part of Disneyland. Because as an adult, I actually went there. It was very dissatisfying. But as a kid, I saw this, and I don't know if it's my Sagittarian nature or what it is, but I wanted to be on that road, and I wanted to be behind that driveway. I wanted to be moving, and then I realized, well, I live in a very materially depleted environment. That was never going to happen. But then I found this old car that was just sitting, and so I thought, I'd been watching my dad drive and my mom drive, and so I'd go and play in that car, and I'd shift the gears, and I'd push the clutch in. I mean, I had this fantasy world of driving this car. And then my dad, he saw me doing all this. And so one day he needed someone to go actually drive a car. And so he came and he taught me how to really drive a car, and I went over and helped him, and I thought, it kind of morphed. I took this really strong desire I had, I was playing with it,
And it became real.
and it became a reality, yeah.
But yeah, and I was gonna ask you.
But it wasn't going to Autotopia.
Right.
Well,
But it
then
was-
then you also
Part of
can
it.
measure your expectation.
Right.
You know more about yourself.
I read
when
my
that
environment.
happens.
Yes, I was able to read my
You
environment. too.
really know a lot about yourself by measuring that was satisfaction for you relative to that desire. You first read your environment, and then
Yeah. And then I was able to
You
find
move
ways
that
to
desire.
satisfy the desire.
Well,
Yeah.
see, but it's almost like you allow when the expectation. You brought something up, and you're really right with expectation, because when you stop with the expectation and all you have was the desire to drive. Your expectation wasn't, I'm going to go there and do that. Your expectation was, I thought that was really neat, and I'm going to finish
I wanted to satisfy that
The
need.
feeling.
Right, that we.
But what
that
happened
feeling.
was you
Right.
allowed for anything possible to
Right.
happen. You didn't have an expectation, I'm only going to be happy when I go to that
Right.
auto place.
Right. Well, I didn't know that. It just
Right.
seemed like the environment kept
But often,
showing me these opportunities.
Right.
So I followed.
Oh,
them.
So maybe that
Exactly.
is what the desire nature,
Right.
how the desire nature can fulfill that. And maybe you didn't even read your environment. Possibly in the way that Zane speaks
yeah,
to, we release the desire,
yes.
and in releasing the desire, that desire can actually come back to us if we are connected, open to the possibilities.
Right. That's-
Releasing the expectation.
Yes.
Yes, so that we are open to the possibilities.
Of anything, because it doesn't have to, your expectation
feeling
is,
you're
it doesn't
after.
have to look like what you expect.
Right.
Well, I had an experience when I was in basic training where everything was just, my whole world upside down. You might relate to that, right? In the Air Force. But I was very excited about the whole process, but it's so changing that I wanted simple things. And I remember at night one time when I was finally alone with my thoughts, and I was like, I just want to walk in the grass again. Very simple things is all I wanted. And sure enough, the next day, surprise enough, we all lined up at the beginning of this little area of grass, and we all got trash bags, and we were told to walk. And I'm walking, and I was like, I thought I just asked for this. I just want to walk in the grass. And I said, I love this. And I did. It was wonderful. But I wasn't, I didn't put the expectation that I have to be in Hawaii and I have to have this type of grass and this. I allowed it, and then I saw it, and that was wonderful.
Do you know what you
It was
allowed
wonderful.
for? The opportunity of the present moment. There is an interpretation that I absolutely love, and it is, let me see if I can recollect it. It is, do not let me be deceived by that which would divert me from my purpose. Rather, let me be open and aware of the opportunity of the present moment. Now, that is an interpretation of a line in the Lord's Prayer, which I could never wrap my head around, which was, do not lead me into temptation.
Right.
Well, if he's God, he's not going to do that. He's not going to do that to me. And when I found that interpretation, that is exactly what you expressed, that we have desires, and those desires, if we are aware to have those desires fulfilled in a way, we need to be open and listening to our inner intuition,
Right.
then not judging it, appreciate it, because they happen.
Right. And
Wow!
And if
But it's the present moment.
Right, and if I had put an expectation on it that it had, then I would have been mad at this, picking up trash. But no.
It was picking up trash.
Let me
It was
interject
walking
something
through
here.
Yes.
There's a question
Great.
from Alice Marie. She says, do
Yes.
expectations equal fantasy? it is said that the best way to live is without expectations.
Exactly.
So, you want to comment on
Yes, I love that. Okay, so expectation and fantasy. I would say you put an expectation on a fantasy, but if you don't put an expectation on a fantasy, your desires and fantasy thoughts can manifest if you stop with the expectation. Just like you did. You didn't have an expectation that you had to go to Autoplex to fulfill this fantasy. You just had this desire because it was a feeling.
Right.
And she didn't have expectation, and it was fulfilled, I think, from the magnificent universe in its infinite wisdom will fulfill those desires if you allow for it to be fulfilled in its own way.
Well, I even have this feeling
In my
that
opinion.
our desires come to us in rudimentary form.
Yes.
That if there is this divine plan that we're moving toward,
Yeah.
it comes to us in little bits and pieces that you only learn to get the bigger picture when you follow those little tiny pieces that come to you. That's my experience.
Right.
Or I think that's what it is.
Yeah. You know, because
So you have to let it go.
Right. Because I think people get so disappointed when they have a desire and they expect the result to be a certain thing, you know, and you don't have that expectation. You can have the desire, you can have the fantasy because you're looking for a feeling, a sensation, but don't put the expectation that it has to look like this to be fulfilled.
Right.
It can be filled in many forms, and you have to look at it and say yes. And actually, I wanted people to kind of do this as a homework thing, is to write down all that you desired when you were in high school, getting ready to graduate high school, or that time period you didn't graduate high school. And write down all the things that you remember you wanting, and then however old you are, write when those things got fulfilled and how you felt afterwards. And then see what made you most happy in life. And then I wrote, usually what makes people most happy is when they're, find your inner sense of what makes you most happy inwardly. Because I went through the whole thing of what would make me happiest. Fantasize the limit. Like you had the most amount of money, the most ability to do anything in the world, and fantasize that. And then think if you fulfilled that, how would you feel? And with the physical things, we often feel like, that's it.
Would everybody turn around and say hello to
Do you want
Dorothy?
to say hello to
Hello, Dorothy.
Hi,
Dorothy.
Dorothy.
Okay.
Hey, Dorothy.
I also have a lesson in how to give up a desire
Yeah.
with no problem.
Yeah.
We moved to England, and we were not living in a place. It was cold. Cold is always important to me. I need to be warm. And I also always wanted to live in a Georgian house. And so I would see people living in these, in the squatter and whatever, living in Georgian houses. And I think, oh man, why didn't we get a Georgian house? Like, wine. So I went to a coffee in one of these Georgian houses, and I almost froze to death. And I never, ever again looked at a Georgian house and had any desire to live in it. And that was so pretty. I didn't know saying yeah, but I thought, you know what? This is really good. This is how you give up a desire because you had an experience. And you learn from that experience, and you pay attention.
There's also an addendum to that. I want to say that, but we can't just always suppress a desire.
No.
You kind of you had to fulfill it partially.
Yes.
And then you have to know what that feels like, because always just suppressing it actually builds up energy, just like a bomb builds up.
Straining to release.
And you suppressing actually builds up energy. So in that form, you only have to partially fulfill that fantasy and have a bad experience with it and go, I'm good. I don't need it anymore.
That question about expectation versus fantasy intrigued me because in my experience, I think of expectations as narrowing,
Yes.
as too narrowing.
Exactly.
They limit God's possibilities from manifesting in my life because of my preconceived notions that just are way too limited. And I think of fantasy as dissipating energy because it's too broad and unbounded. So they're sort of opposite to me. Expectations are constraining, and fantasies are nebulously, Neptunian and just ever expanding. And that's so either one of those extremes can prevent me from effectively using my consciousness.
Absolutely.
Directing my thinking or whatever.
I would agree with that. You kind of take the middle road where you bring in some thoughts of higher fantasy thinking, but you also, you can't have expectation. You have to have a goal and work towards it, but you can't have all that restrictive expectation.
Well,
that
some
it has
people
to
would
be.
say that having a goal and working toward it is very clear expectation.
Maybe.
Well,
Yes.
that's good. Are you?
Uh-huh.
I mean, are you saying that's a good thing?
I'm
or-
saying the negative side of having expectations is that it's too constraining on my mind.
But I think there are some things, some efforts to which we direct our attention that require us to get focused.
I think so, too.
And very clearly defined.
And having expectations can further
Right.
us toward our goals.
And it'll take you down the path, and you may learn later on from the response you're getting from the environment that, oh, well, maybe I need to modify that.
Mhm.
But you would never get to that point of modification if you didn't have it.
Mhm.
Is that, yeah?
I don't know. I haven't been a very good planner. I'm not great with expectations.
I've become a good
The expectation thing, there was a period of time in the 80s or 90s where this expectations got a bad name,
Yeah.
right? And it had a lot to do with the new stuff on, marriage relationships.
Oh.
Don't you remember all that stuff? It was in
No.
books and counselors
Yeah,
used a lot of it saying,
expectations.
hey, you have expectations of your partner
Oh, yeah.
that
yeah.
are
Unrealistic.
never going to be fulfilled. So
Well, that's-
you're living in a fantasy.
Yep.
That's
Whereas
not
there's
negative,
another way to
that's
use the
still
word
real.
that's not negative. But it got that kind of negative connotation, I think.
Uh-huh.
That kind
Well,
of,
and also that particular insight into expectation is an insight into the psyche in general of how we tend to project our conditioning on, I'm expecting you to be my father
Exactly.
in a relationship.
Right.
And I'm not
Exactly.
conscious of it, so the expectation is knee-jerkedly going on, and I'm hamstrung by it.
Right.
And you're
Exactly.
not that, and I'll never be satisfied with you because
Right.
that unconscious
you're
desire
stuck
is
in that
for it.
relationship.
Right,
You can't go
yeah.
anywhere.
And
Right.
I'm learning that too. The expectation is my own issue because I had a lot of expectation in my last relationship, and I was so unhappy. But it was because of my own expectations, because I had to have it look like. That's why I was talking about expectation, allowing it to be what it is, and allowing it to be open to other things to come in to make you happy. That it doesn't look like what you're expecting.
However, now I'd flip.
Yeah.
In that, I do believe that we need to have a mean expectation for certain behaviors.
The baseline.
Well, or
Because
yes,
civilization,
that's
you
culture,
know,
right?
Culture.
Right.
There are certain expectation and markers that advance us all. And if we are not cognizant of that, or if we don't expect that and enable those certain markers for all, us included, to meet, then that's not good either.
Right,
Well,
an expectation
yeah.
of courtesy or kindness
Well,
or
yeah, but
reciprocity.
Well, it
or-
depends on how realistic the expectation is.
Exactly. It's
Vicky's-
reality,
in
environment.
Vicky's example, dreaming about driving this car. Well, if her expectation was that someday I will get to drive a car, then that expectation was met and she was satisfied and fulfilled. If her expectation was to become a Grand Prix race car driver, not too realistic, and if she was still striving to do that and not ever achieving that goal, then she would be
Right.
unsatisfied.
Can I put some expectation, cultural, because I studied anthropology in college. So I'm not trying to be an offensive person or anything, right? If I do this, does this offend you? Does this offend you?
It offended Oprah's audience when Tom Cruise did
In China, this would offend many
Oh, because
people
your feet, yes.
on the chair.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful about your expectation, because you might see a person and you have an expectation, but they're coming from another culture. And you don't know that you're expecting them to be friendly and nice and cover their mouth when they sneeze and etc. That's your cultural expectation. You can't put that on everybody, because some people feel that they are being as proper and civilized as possible, but their culture tells them other things are different, right? So you have to be careful about your expectation, though. And I would allow for expectation. It's a little restrictive in my mind.
Well,
Okay, yeah. Hey, everybody, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Not the 4th of July.
Brittany said wonderful,
July
thank
11th.
you for everything, and Alice Marie,
Hi, Alice Marie.
and Stephen,
hey, Stephen.
Mike Salter.
Mike Salter.
Yeah, so we had,
Great.
and then there's lurkers out there.
We know the
lurkers.
Hi, anonymous people. We'll keep you anonymous if you want to be. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Gosh,